everyone. This is Mame. This is Independent Voice. In today's video, I have Karanja Kashusha, and I would like to give him some time to introduce himself. And then we're going to get into some interesting questions. We'll have some conversations and we'll take it from there. Thank you for being here. Karanja, please take a moment and introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Mame, for having me. My name is Karanja Kashusha. I'm a journalist, an activist, not necessarily in that order. A political analyst from Kenya, based in Washington, D.C., but covering African affairs from a global perspective.
Thank you so much. He's an incredible journalist that has been covering a lot of the African issues. He's been modest right now. He's very active. He's done a lot. He has a lot to say, and I'm grateful to have opportunity to really spend some time with you, Karanja, and kind of prod your thinking about some of the things that's been happening, especially in the recent weeks and days within the world of Africa. It looks like, for anyone who's following or who has been following social media, Africa has caught fire. The mainstream media is not talking about it, not as much. So much is happening and people have made their own minds. We hear different narratives about it. There is a story that is coming out of Africa, which is really huge for all of us. We've been following it very, very closely. What do you think Africa is up to? What's happening in the world of Africa?
I think what's happening in Africa for Africans is that Africans have, thank God for social media, for the internet, we have become a global village. And so Africans are very aware about not just the things that are going on in their own backyard, but globally. The thing that Africans have woken up to is just how important Africa is to the world, how important our resources, especially our human resources, are to the globe, but also our natural resources. Africans are very aware that we are driving the economies of countries, people that Africans have always looked up to and admired and thought of as places that were developed and doing very well. The question then has to arise, why is it that if we are driving these economies, if our natural resources, if our human resources are driving this development, are very much part of a very essential and central component of this development, this economic boom that we see in China, in the West, why is it that we are not enjoying the fruits of our labor, our natural resources? So Africans are aware that there is an injustice, there is something awry, there is an imbalance that not everyone can necessarily explain, not everyone agrees on why it is, but it is very present. There's an awareness that something is wrong and something needs to change. The great bulk of Africans believe that the problem is lies right at home with their leadership, right? Mm-hmm. And there's plenty of blame to go around. Mm-hmm. The other thing that Africans are aware of is that we were all colonized, except for Ethiopia and Liberia. Every single African country was colonized, and even Ethiopia wasn't entirely spared. And never mind the Italians, the West has done a pretty good job in recent times. I think despite never having been politically colonized, Ethiopia has not been spared by the global multinational conglomerates, who, by the way, are wreaking havoc across the globe, even in their own countries, even in the United States, even in the UK and in Europe. So people are aware about the presence of these corporations. People are aware about the extraction, the exploitation. People don't necessarily agree on what needs to be done. People don't necessarily even agree on where exactly what needs to be changed. And what needs to be changed is usually tied in with what is the source of the problem, right? So people don't necessarily agree, but they know there's something wrong. So Africans want change. I believe that there are some Africans who have woken up to the realization that there is a hierarchy of problems. And at the top of that hierarchy is global imperialism. And so that class of Africans, that group of Africans that have that outlook are very aware that what needs to be crashed is global capitalism, same thing, global capitalism, global imperialism, first and foremost. And then we can deal with everything else. We can deal with the institutions, we can deal with systems, we can deal with systems of government even. We can deal with, the other thing that Africans are very aware of is that what they have been sold to, what has been sold to them as democracy is questionable. They are questioning what that means. Africans are looking back at systems that we've had in the past and comparing that with the systems that we have presently. Africans are also comparing systems across the globe. In the Middle East, they have monarchies. In China, they have their own system. Africans are very aware of the noises, the information being fed to them from one direction, in particular the West, about, for example, China. But then it's a global village. Everyone is aware that China has raised over 700 million people from poverty since the year 2000 through to the year 2018, by the way. So who knows how many people it is? Probably 1 billion by now, right? From poverty into the middle, into the middle class. So there's that awareness. So the primary awareness is that something is very wrong, something needs to change. People understand that global imperialism and the history of colonialism has something to do with what's not working. Of course, the challenge is that it's always very easy to pinpoint problems. Providing solutions is a lot more complicated, and that's where everyone disagrees, including in the West, in fixing their own problems, right?
Yeah, interesting. So, this is the benefit of talking to a journalist, and you've already made so many points. I want to take this conversation a little bit back. You had mentioned at the onset of your speaking to this question, you had said that Africans have been awakened. Thank you so much. Technology, when it works, it does, right? What is it that Africans, the continent itself, is being awakened? What caused that awakening? Because it's not like things didn't happen in Africa before. In the recent days, the stuff with Niger, stuff that's happening all around Africa, something has ignited this awakenedness. Can we talk a little bit about that?
What has awakened the awareness? That's kind of difficult to pinpoint. However, I would say that access to information is at the core of it. And that access comes from the global village, access to the internet, Twitter, social media, right? Not just mainstream media, because mainstream media is so filtered and only gives the information that global, particularly and specifically global Western capitalism, violent, extractive capitalism wants to portray. So social media has a lot to do with it. But I also think that there has been an acceleration of problems, right? There has been pandemic, there is a global cost of living crisis, there is global inflation, which is imported, personally, I believe, from the excess printing of dollars. And what happens when any country prints excess money is that everybody who uses the money in that economy gets affected by hyperinflation. Well, you would think that United States inflation would only affect the United States. The United States printing money would only affect the United States, but that's not how the globe works, because the dollar is really the global currency. We all use the dollar, whether or not we acknowledge it, whether or not we actually see green bucks on our streets, in our stores, in our wallets, across Africa. Every single commodity, including the ones coming out of Africa, are traded in dollars. So that hyperinflation has been exported all the way down to the least of us in terms of economies, right? Mm-hmm. So America prints excess dollars. Americans have excess money to spend, causes hyperinflation in America to a certain extent, but still people are cushioned. However, when that hyperinflation is exported to the rest of the globe, people are experiencing these extreme difficulties where they cannot afford a daily meal. So you're right, Africans, a lot has been going on that's wrong for a long time, but Africans were still able to struggle and strive and still, get a meal on their table, even if it's one a day, oftentimes not 3 meals, right? Mm-hmm. And it's amazing because I feel like Africans are so resilient and so, what's the word I'm looking for here? They withstand so much. So even when they're able to put one meal on the table for their families, mm-hmm. they're not coming out to riot or to demonstrate or to demand more. But now in this current state, they can't even put one meal mm-hmm. on the table. They can't access medication. They can't access hospital care. So that those problems of extreme difficulties have also exacerbated, combined with the access to information that allows even a pastoralist, herding their cattle, mm-hmm. to be able to access information across the globe on their cell phones, because cell phones are everywhere, mm-hmm. So it's a convergence of things. It's access to information, it's the extreme difficulties, it's the awareness that the West continues to somehow flourish. Right. So it's a convergence.
It's true. It is true. So I've noticed even some of our African leaders are accessing social media to reach out to the larger community. What I'm thinking is lately there's been cutting of ties, building new relationships in some ways in Africa. In your opinion, where do you think Africa is heading? Economically, that is, maybe economically, and I'm sure politics probably have something to do with it. Where do you think Africa is heading?
Well, I guess this question really brings me back to the current affairs, current events in Niger, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and in Guinea, generally in French-speaking West Africa, it would appear, and it does appear, I guess, when you really look at it, that the French-speaking African countries tend to all be in, from central, West Central to West Africa, right? Starting in Cameroon, the Congo, Cameroon, Central African Republic, and then going west. So generally West Africa, French-speaking West Africa, I think there is an awakening that has happened there that is very, very clear and single-minded, that French imperialism is at the core of their problems. That is a very clear message that is coming out of the French-speaking countries. The citizenry in those countries are telling us that they no longer want ties with France. The citizenry in the rest of Africa, and we don't really talk about the other countries that are non-English or non-French speaking. So for example, Angola, Mozambique, where Portuguese is spoken, or the Comoros, or Guinea Equatorial, where they speak Spanish. We don't really look at those countries, but I think that there's a similar awakening, for example, in Equatorial Guinea, about the fact that even though they're Spanish speaking, I think that the citizenry in that country, because they are also very much related to their relatives, to their cousins in the rest of West Africa, also have similar awakenings about their colonial past and present, the imperialism. By the way, I never talk about neocolonialism. I don't think we are there yet. We are still in colonialism, right? And I'm going to come back to that in a second. So, but there's this awakening across Africa about needing to renegotiate, not necessarily to renegotiate for themselves what kind of systems they want, what kind of alliances they want. China has made its presence felt across the whole continent, and that cuts across the different languages spoken, including Eritrea, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Angola. It doesn't matter where, West Africa, French speaking, English speaking, everywhere. So there's an awareness that there can be a different type of relationship. There is this sense, these sentiments that China is perhaps giving better deals. There is also a reality, not just a perception, that China is building, right? China is building infrastructure. Countries that have it, everyone is aware of where it's working, and people, those countries where China isn't building as much are looking at that and thinking, we want some of that. So I don't think that the ideology comes first. I think that what is coming first is sort of people just taking a look around at their environment and seeing what is going on and thinking, we want a bit of that. And then the analysis about how that is coming about follows that. So, human beings, we all think about analysts as the only people who analyze, right? And in reality, political analysts, you name it, geopolitical analysts or economic analysts. But in reality, all human beings are analysts. All human beings observe and analyze and, try to make sense of what it is that they're seeing and analyzing. So there is a sense, people watching Chinese building infrastructure versus people watching Westerners coming in and not being very clear what they're doing is making people question their old alliances, because all of Africa, having been previously carved up as it was in the Berlin Conference between about 8 small European countries, have essentially been, Africans are questioning those alliances. They are questioning that paternalism from those countries. And so it's, and then the Europeans from all of these countries are still very much present. What we see them doing is living the good life in Africa. We don't see them creating, we don't see them building. So that is causing people to want something different. And so deals are being
the awakening. That is the one thing that people are being awakened to and saying, wait, what have we gotten thus far? Right? Because as you put it, China has started doing all these things in the recent years, and there is something tangible that people could see. We all have our own opinions and our own questions in terms of what China is doing in Africa. I think what Africans are, or the continent is awakening to, is all these years that certain other countries have been in the continent, what did they contribute to the benefit of the economy, I guess, is what the biggest awakening is.
I would completely agree with you. And so, and the economy drives everything. The economy when the economy is functioning, it means it makes the difference between whether or not you can put food on the table for your family. When there's infrastructure, it improves the economy. It means that you can get to the hospital quicker. It means you can get to work. You can get your farm produce to market. So when these things are coming, and you don't have to be a political analyst or a geopolitical analyst because, and by the way, Africans, I think by necessity are a lot more politically aware because these things are spoken everywhere. So even in the rural areas of Kenya, you go to anywhere amongst the pastoralists, they're going to tell you, oh, this road was built by the Chinese. So Africans, we communicate a lot to our relatives wherever they are. And so anywhere you go, they're going to tell you this bridge was built and this was built by the Chinese. This was built by the Japanese.
Right.
Like I always find it very interesting because you go to Nairobi, for example, or anywhere in Kenya, and people will distinguish, right? I remember, for example, one road by my grandmother's where my brother told me, oh, this was built by the Norwegians, for example. But those statements aren't being made anymore about the West, right? About them building, because they're just not doing that anymore. And I don't even think that they're doing that in their own countries. They don't have the capacity. They definitely don't have the capacity to do it overseas.
Yeah, it seems as though the focus has changed for some reason, and that's not the conversation here. Honestly, it seems as though the focus, the priority, where they're at sort of shifted. And I think that awakening should happen, or it's about to happen because, well, we're struggling economically, right? We're here, we're watching it, we can listen to it, and we can deduce where the West and, even in the States here, where the economy is going. People are talking about inflation. People are talking about, where am I going to get the next meal? And I think Africa is at the verge of saying, hey, wait a second, we're thinking differently. We're becoming a better bargainer. I think they're bargaining better for themselves, and kudos to those leaders that are doing that. So with that said, though, it's all about economic development. It's all about the health of the economy. And when the economy is healthy, so is the people, right? It's a ripple effect. What is the role of the diaspora in general to contribute to this awakening to mean something, to actually really mean something? Is there any part, any role of the diaspora? And I don't mean just one specific country, but across the board, all Africans. Have we joined this awakening? Do we have any part? What parts do we have, or what role do we play? And I don't mean just politically, but to really make sure that this awakening is going to mean something.
I think the biggest contribution that the diaspora can make to our mother countries is the awareness more than anything else. I know that there's been a big deal that has been made about remittances, but I think that is actually way overstated. But it's a contribution, to be sure. But the biggest contribution really is the awareness. It's having lived in the West gives you a different perspective. It allows you to see what is actually happening up close. And it definitely wakens you to a different reality. It wakens you to how the economies in the countries that we admired when we were at home are functioning. The exploitation, even within these countries, particularly of people of color. The disregard and dismissal of the contributions of people of color makes you realize that if they are doing that to the people of color, to Africans, basically, to people of African descent in these countries, that if they have such disregard to their own citizens who are of African descent, that they cannot possibly have more regard for those of us that are on the continent, that they don't even have to deal with or touch or care for their welfare or even see what the effects of their exploitation is. And so that awareness wakes you up to then start questioning everything you thought you knew. And so it makes us the best ambassadors for the lies, for the exploitation, for the truth. It makes us want different for our continent. It makes us question the international treaties, the international organizations, the old world order, or the rules-based order that they talk about at the UN and the international NGOs and all of that stuff. So that is the biggest contribution. Of course, there is the contribution of remittances. I honestly think that is greatly, greatly, greatly overstated. People keep talking about the fact that I think that remittances exceed a contribution, and I keep forgetting to check this, whether it's that they exceed foreign direct investment or if they exceed foreign aid. It's one of the two, or maybe both. I don't know, but it exceeds an important figure that either foreign direct investment or foreign aid. By the way, there's no such thing as foreign aid. It's loans that are Shylockian that we have repaid over and over and over again, like tenfold. And so that figure is hugely overstated, because you would think that means that we are contributing more to the economy than anything else, and that's not the reality. The reality is that tea, coffee, uranium, bauxite, whatever it is that we are exporting, still, and not just exporting, whatever we are producing, right? We are productive. We are productive people. All of those things combined far exceed diaspora remittances. I can't help thinking that this overstating of diaspora contribution isn't part of the psychological warfare to try and suggest that somehow the only way you can become a useful person, a useful African, is when you have lived in Europe or America, in the West, right? And therefore, it's essentially very much a white supremacist kind of trope, suggesting that living amongst white people somehow makes you a better person. So we really need to push back on all of this PSYOPs BS, because that's exactly what I think it is. So we need to stop overstating it. We need to right size our contribution and be very clear that the people that are actually contributing to the growth of the African economy are Africans on the continent.
You got it. It
is very essential that we do that, because I do think that it's part of the psychological warfare.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you said that, because I started writing a blog and I did some research on it. And indeed, this whole remittance thing is so exaggerated. And I kind of stopped to want to do some more, because I thought, well, from what I've heard, it kind of sounded like Africa was standing because of the remittance. And wow, remittance didn't happen, so the country's going to crash. And I'm like, wait, let me read some more, because that's not true. You're right. The continent is standing on its own 2 feet by the things that the country is producing, not just export, but whatever it is that's being produced within the country is what's holding up the majority. Am I saying it's not helping? No. Am I saying we shouldn't do that? No. But we can't get it to our head either to say that without the diaspora's remittance, stuff isn't going to happen. It will happen. It will contribute. I think there are more things that we can do to help with it, but sometimes that takes the narrative slightly differently. And I think the opinion of the diaspora changes because of that. So I think it's good to clarify that. I'm glad you brought that up. So that's a very strong message, by the way, to put out there. I've heard quite a lot, especially last year, so much about remittance and what it's doing. I mean, it's true. India has done it. They do have some research out there that says the diaspora has contributed a lot to the growth of the economy, but it's not because of just the remittance that's going into the country, but how the country changed the system to help the diaspora become part of the economy. Here's a question where we're talking about economic development, and we touched on a very sensitive, I think, topic, which is good. What message do you have for the people in Africa, for the diaspora, on maybe two things? One, how we use social media and how we get the information and what we do with it. Second, how do we change our own mindset? Because I think the thinking has to change. I think it's one thing to be very emotional, very, we got this. We also have to open our eyes and take a look at the reality and how, to what degree and to what extent our reality allows us to do what we need to do for the continent, and how do we bring the continent of Africa, and I mean all of us, the diaspora included, on to some level to the same page. What message do you have? I know it's pretty loaded, but we can take it apart.
Yeah, I think. Well, I think that we need to be, we need a consciousness reawakening. We need to, there's a battle with white supremacy that has to be constantly waged because it changes. It's very versatile. White supremacy is the tools of white supremacy and colonialism and imperialism and the psychological warfare, the colonial the mental colonialism is very versatile and ever changing. Mm-hmm. So, so for example, with that discussion about diaspora, like we need to challenge those narratives. We need to question those narratives. It started troubling me, for example, when I started hearing people state, and I heard this from somebody that I really respect and who's actually more than just a personal friend. I call her mom and she calls me son. So this is not a critique, but I heard per se, but I heard her refer to, and this is Dr. Arikana Chihombori-Kwao, the former African Union ambassador to the United States. She, in some of her presentations, and I was actually the one recording these presentations for her, where she says that only the diaspora can do this or that or the other. And I remember it being very disturbing to me because it was a new thing that I had heard and it didn't sit well with me. And I wasn't clear at the time what it was, but it struck a chord in me. And I needed to analyze what that thing that I heard that didn't sit right was, and so that's where the analysis of right sizing our contribution came from. So we need to be challenging our outlook, and we need to be challenging white supremacy. We need to be constantly analyzing the new language, the new methods that are being used, and I'd be very curious to see what the Indian diaspora, for example, contributed, because India is an economy of over $5 trillion. I forget exactly how much. It's definitely over $5 trillion, probably a lot more than that even. So I can't imagine that the Indian diaspora is contributing even $1 trillion. The African, for example, diaspora contributed I think 96 billion last year in 2022. So under 100 billion, the whole diaspora combined. Nigeria alone is an economy of nearly $500 billion. Mm-hmm. So clearly, the 36 billion that Nigerians sent home is not the one that is propping up the 500 billion economy. So challenging narratives is something that we have to constantly do. It's the number one most essential thing, because those narratives drive everything else. They drive policy, they drive our outlook, they drive our perceptions, they drive people to do awful, horrible things like getting like paying traffickers to traffic them through the Sahara Desert and go to Libya, where if they are lucky not enough not to be turned into slaves, they then get on rickety boats and drown. And only a few make it across to Europe. For what? Right? So narrative is very important, because I have honestly come to the conclusion, and this might sound callous, and so I always hesitate to say it, but it dawned on me that young African kids are really just dying crossing the Mediterranean for Nike and iPhones.
Yep.
Because narrative is that powerful, because they're looking at Instagram. So this is the other side of social media. They're looking at Instagram and they're seeing people taking glamorous images, showing off their Jordans and their Nike and their Louis Vuitton and whatever it is, and their iPhones. And they want that life. And for a young teenager anywhere on the planet, you can't fault them for wanting that life. However, for us adults, especially for those of us who live in the diaspora, it is really incumbent on us, especially for us African diaspora, to be very honest about the fact that that Louis Vuitton is not something I'm ever going to buy, even living here. So narrative is really important, though that $400 pair of Jordans is not something I've ever bought in my whole
People never do.
And why would I? For what purpose? Like, it's just a pair of sneakers. You wear them once, they're no longer new. Like, so narrative is really that important, because I think Africans are dying because of narrative. So it cannot be overstated. So that's something that we need to challenge. We need to, and that then brings me to the next part of your question, which is about social media ownership. We need to own our own media. We need to own our own media, mainstream media, our own news outlets, our own social media. That will go a long way in changing narrative, because then when we own the media, when we own the social media, when we own the mainstream media, we have a little bit more control. Until then, our responsibility is to use social media as much as possible to counter the narrative. So we have that responsibility. But ultimately, what we absolutely must do is have our own social media. The kind of messages that I see, for example, in Kenyan WhatsApp groups, WhatsApp, owned by Facebook, an American company, the types of message forwards that I see in private chat groups, on the family groups, on the different political Kenyan websites, so much of the garbage, for it's the only word I have for it, about the culture wars in the United States, the fights over abortion, over LGBTQ issues, and those cultural fights that really have nothing to do with us Africans. Those are not cultural fights that we are having organically, but they are being exported to us via the alliances that people have forged over social media. So you travel to the United States as part of your church or whatever it is, whatever religious group you belong to, and then you form alliances, or those people come as evangelists to Africa, and then now you're connected via WhatsApp, and then now they're starting to forward you the culture wars via WhatsApp, and then it's being forwarded and showing up, and then it's now turning our political landscape into culture war fights instead of the productive discussions about how we want to lead our economy. And those culture wars are now becoming part of our lexicon and becoming part of our politics. They're very destructive. They're very tribal, as we see in the United States, right? And very unproductive. And what they do is serve a very useful purpose for politicians to distract the citizenry into not delivering, into not doing what needs to be done for the citizenry very, very effectively. They're such an effective tool of distraction and destructiveness, right? Distraction and destruction. So we need to do the best we can to counter those narratives. It's a very uphill battle when I see those culture wars and try to convince my family members, even trying to convince my family members that those are not organic fights that or discussions or issues that we need to be focused on is so futile, because that garbage seems to really strike emotional, nerve endings that create apparently some type of adrenaline and the other thing that I forget what they're called, the nodes, the receptors in the brain for pleasure. Like it touches those. In very destructive ways, like a drug. So it's very, very difficult to counter those narratives. But I'm willing to bet that you're not finding that so much on WeChat, right? So, and what's the difference there? WeChat owned by the Chinese. So ownership makes all the difference.
And we're feeding to it. For some reason, we're not necessarily paying attention to it. We bought into it, we've become consumers of it, and the end result is being controlled by it. And it changes our behavior, it changes our mindset, it changes who we are as a person, quite honestly, and it has. I think somebody needs to hit that bell and say, watch it, because if we really think about it, and if we think back, I don't know, maybe 10 years, we're not the person that we were 10 years ago because of social media. We don't think the same way. We don't behave the same way. Maybe 10 years, 15 years before all this complete looseness of social media and us becoming completely consumed by it, because we have become 100% consumers of social media. Our attitude has changed, the mindset has changed, how we deal with social stuff changed, how we look, our outlook towards politics has changed, how we even see one another has changed. It impacted that, how we accept one another, how we relate to one another, how we, humanity as we know it has changed. And one of the tools is social media. And I can talk about this all day long because it bothers me so much. I have become a consumer of social media. This is what we're doing right now. We're using technology, but I believe that you can use it for something positive, and then you can also use it for something else if you really don't know how to draw the line somewhere and consume with reason and consume to some degree with smartness. It'll get you, it'll change who you are. And sometimes we catch that and we try to draw the line somewhere. So we're getting towards the end of our conversation, Karanja. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm learning a lot listening to you. We're touching on some interesting topics and some things that I hope we will continue to discuss moving forward. In wrapping this up, what message do you have for all of us?
I wasn't expecting that. I don't know that I have a specific message for all of us. The only message that I have, I think, if there's anything, is inform yourself. We are talking about social media, for example. I think it's one of the greatest tools for information. It's also one of the greatest tools of the destruction, for example, of democracy. What do I mean by that? It provides entertainment. Entertainment is very easy to consume. It's very easy to get distracted with entertainment, with scrolling through Instagram for images of, it's always dancing Africans, right? People are, I think white people talk about cats, but for us Africans, it's always something to do with music, right? It's very beautiful. It's very easy to get distracted of the types of vacations, holidays, parties that you want to do. And how does it destroy democracy? In the West, entertainment, I truly believe, is used to distract people so that they're not paying attention, right? I think what I'm asking Africans to do is to do the extraordinary and the superhuman, which is to so much be aware of the ways in which we are being manipulated, to be distracted. And so it's a superhuman thing that I'm asking Africans to do, because it's not the natural human thing to do. The natural human thing to do is to go with the flow, and the flow is, dance videos, right? And with that distraction by entertainment, people aren't paying attention to what is actually happening on the news. So you find people voting against their own interests. So you find that people can so easily be distracted to the point that they're not able to even inform themselves about what is good for them. It's already happening in Kenya, like the fights and I'm guessing that means it's happening elsewhere in Africa. So, for example, corporations in America have become very, very effective at fighting against taxation so that they're not taxed, so that they are, they're constantly lobbying to be given favorable treatment so that they pay the bare minimum in taxes and continue to reap from the government in grants for R&D, research and development, as they call it, and all of those other grants that they get, and tax breaks and what have you. So they've become very effective at making people believe that the fights, the anti-tax fights, are for them, for their own good. And that I see that being exported to Kenya now. Like there's this strong anti-tax push. And in reality, the reason that it's happening is because American companies, starting in January 2023, now have to pay a 15% corporate income tax in Kenya. Before it was zero. Kenya is probably only one of the 55 African countries, maybe South Africa. African governments are not implementing laws making sure that American companies are paying taxes. Not only do African countries not have policies about taxing these people, the IMF, the global financial manipulators, the global financial cop, the police of global economics, demand actually that African countries do not tax these corporations. So we do generally what our colonial masters tell us to do. And so there are no laws making sure that these companies are paying taxes on the revenues, on the incomes that they are making, on the profits that they are making. The argument pushed by the World Bank and the IMF is that if you tax these companies, they are not going to come to your countries. And they argue that the way that you benefit from having these companies in your countries is that they create employment, and the employment then provides income taxes from the employees. Well, these corporations are generally paying slave wages. So the slave wages that they're paying, the governments are only able to extract a minimal amount of tax from these slave wages anyway. So these companies get away with murder. They just, so their primary function across Africa is to extract. They contribute close to nothing. Those income taxes are not sufficient, which is why our economies struggle. So you will hear, the detractors, some of the Africans who argue that the only problem in Africa is corruption, and if we didn't have corruption, that it doesn't matter whether we own the companies or not. And then, like I heard, for example, these detractors that I'm talking about, comparing the presence of American companies in the UK and in Ireland. The reality is that these countries, British firms are also in the United States. Barclays, for example, is a major British bank. So there's a symbiosis whereby there's an exchange. It's not just American companies coming into England to extract. And if they did, it would be exactly the same. Like the economies would suffer. But that's not what happens, because they do have laws and treaties that allow them to have businesses in each other's countries that are mutually beneficial. We don't have those deals with the West. They make it impossible for our companies. For example, Safaricom, the Kenyan telco giant, it has the best services I have a number of phones. I have multiple nationalities and residencies across the world. So for example, I have a French phone, I have a British phone, I have American phone and Kenyan phone, and by the way, a Tanzanian phone as well. The phone, my cell phone service, the best cell phone service that I have is my Kenyan cell phone service. And I know I'm obviously very biased, but I'm not just saying that because of my bias. I'm telling you that the one phone, wherever I go anywhere on the planet, that always has service, that I'm always able to do transactions on, is my Kenyan phone line. But Safaricom is only in Kenya. I'm pretty sure, even though I haven't researched this, that if Safaricom wanted to open operations in the United States, it would not be a cakewalk, right?
Oh, yeah.
Whereas a British company wanting to, like T-Mobile is a German company, wanting to open and conduct business in the United States, it's de jure. It's something that they, that the infrastructure already exists, right?
Right.
So there are inbuilt disadvantages that we have. And part of the reason, we really didn't talk about this, so I'm going to touch on it a little bit. Part of the reason why, for example, I am in such admiration of what is going on in French-speaking West Africa, specifically in Burkina Faso and Mali in particular, maybe to a certain extent also, it's not clear to me what's happening in Guinea. There's not a lot coming out of there. And obviously, Niger is very early to tell whether it's actually a people-powered takeover or we honestly just don't know. But what I'm in such awe of is that the people in the French-speaking West African countries that have decided that, I think the awakening that they have had is that they need to have a violent cut with a violent break with imperialism, because incrementalism hasn't worked. We have tried incrementalism over the last 60 years and it hasn't worked. We have tried negotiating better. We have tried changing presidents. We have tried introducing term limits for our presidents. It hasn't led to true democracy, meaning people being represented and their systems and countries working for them. So we are not in positions to negotiate with the United States. I heard from this one person, he was an Iranian, who pointed out to me that despite the fact that Iran, a $2 trillion economy, is relatively powerful, the United States will not give Iran any deals whatsoever. They are not willing to negotiate with Iran. The only thing they do with Iran is bully, right? And push and push. And their demeanor towards even a country as powerful and as wealthy, essentially, with a pretty big economy as Iran, they will not negotiate. So they will refuse to negotiate with Iran, but they will agree to negotiate when William Ruto of Kenya is pushing aggressively for good deals with Kenya. No, they won't. And so that is why the violent cut, the abrasive, instantaneous cut from imperialism is needed. We can come back. The world is a global village. We cannot exist in isolation. However, when you're in a violent, abusive relationship, there's no incrementalism that's going to improve that relationship, right? Like I'm talking about personally. Like if you're in an abusive relationship, in a marriage with an abusive man or an abusive woman, you need to make a clean break. And so that's what those countries are doing. They're making a clean break so that they can restart. And I think that that's what we need to do. I think the whole of Africa really needs a clean break from the imperialists, from the former colonizers. We need an absolute, complete, clean break. Cut the umbilical cord, throw it away, done, dusted. Then restart again from scratch. And that is why the relationships with China and with any other partners, and that includes Russia, and which is why Africa has no business wading into the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. We cannot take sides there. It's not our fight. That's a fight between NATO and whatever it is, whoever they're fighting. So we need to be able to make the deals and the alliances that work for us. Right now, those deals, those alliances are with China and with other partners, and that includes Russia. Is not with the West. We have not had good dealings with the West. They do not give us good deals. They do not negotiate in good faith. They have not done anything that has benefited the poorest of the poor Africans. What is happening in places like Kenya, where we have copy-pasted Western democracy so perfectly, I have to tell you, Kenya has done it. Kenya has done everything that we've been asked to do. We have introduced the term limits. We have clean, fair, transparent elections. We have independent judiciary, independent legislature, separated powers from the executive, very independent media, which is in fact extremely irresponsible and does not report accurately about politics, is very one-sided, does not report, and yet they're still very free and they get away with it. An opposition that is, criminal and conducting criminal acts daily and not being prosecuted. So we have implemented everything that the West has demanded. The poorest of the poor Kenyans are it's only getting even harder for them to access even a daily meal, because what that system of Western style quote unquote democracy, which is not democracy at all. It is just a system of extraction and empowerment of corporations. What that system has given us is a bigger divide between the rich and the poor, which is exactly what has happened in the United States over the last 40 plus years since Reaganism took hold. It's the same thing that's happening in Kenya. We have no business going down that route. Right. So we need a clean cut, and then we need to make deals with partners that can actually give us in exchange for our, in exchange for our money, basically, infrastructure. Infrastructure is not in our resources. Infrastructure is never going anywhere. It's going to stay with us. The Western economies have moved to systems where their economies are driven by services, financial services. Well, those financial services, in order for them to be self-sustaining, have to be extremely exploitative, which is why sanctions have become just a tool that's thrown around. Like, you get sanctions, you get sanctions, you get sanctions, Oprah style. Everybody gets sanctions, right? Because they have to make money for their financial system. Their stock markets are the drivers of the economy. They are not manufacturing anymore. Everyone is buying from China. So we need a clean break. We need to move to a system where, in exchange for our resources, we are getting things. We are getting infrastructure. We are getting education. We are getting meaning. We are being taught how to do things for ourselves, how to build our own rockets, how to build our own planes, how to build our own train factories, our own railway factories, our own steel manufacturing plants, right? And if you're not bringing that, then we have no business making deals with you. And I think with that, I think I have probably covered everything that I think we had touched on earlier. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is really interesting. The question that I would put out there and leave it as such, and I agree with you, we do need a clean break. Africa needs a clean break. Whether or not we're ready is a question that I'll leave out there. To what degree, to what extent, and how Africa is ready to do that is yet to be seen, because there is so much that needs to be done. Yes, Africa is being forced to kind of yank the thing and be done with it, because you've already talked so much about it. I won't repeat. But then the what next is everybody's responsibility. There is so much to be done. There is so much to be considered. Once you cut the cord and you separate, then what? That is something that I think needs to be paid attention to, needs a lot of care, needs a lot of attention, needs a lot of detailed work, needs a lot of strategic thinking, strategic planning, all kinds of different things. Now we cut the cord, then what? I guess is what should be thought of, and that could be a next conversation. But thank you so much for your time to share some of your opinions and some of your thoughts, your experiences as a journalist, as a person, as also another African. I appreciate it. This has been very helpful. I look forward to having this kind of conversation with you even more as we move forward. But thank you for everything you do. I know you do a lot. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Mame. I appreciate you having me on and getting to flesh out these thoughts and ideas. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And you do a lot for the continent, so we're appreciative of you. For our listeners, thank you so much for being here again. This is Mame. This is Independent Voice. Have a wonderful day.